Hello and welcome to the Better Than Food podcast. I'm your host, Clifford Lee Sargent. You can support this podcast and YouTube channel by heading over to www.patreon.com/booksarebetterthanfood. This is episode number 1, the beginning of something beautiful. Here I will interview other YouTubers, authors, musicians, artists, philosophers, or people of interest about the 3 books that they feel are essential that are better than food. My very first guest ever has actually supported the show for a long time. Greg Sadler is a philosophy professor who made the leap into YouTube content creation, with over 1,000 videos on his channel, including lectures on Hegel's Phenomenology of the Spirit, which he calls the Half-Hour Hegel series, wherein he breaks down the text paragraph by paragraph. It's brilliant. We had a great chat. His book recommendations were, as you could guess, philosophical texts, though if you find yourself intimidated by them, don't be. In fact, we discussed the reasons why you should just dive in. I enjoyed our talk very much, and I can't wait to have him on again. Check it out. Oh, man.
Hey, Cliff.
Hey, Greg. How you doing? Here we go.
All right. Hey, can you hear me all right with this mic?
I can hear you just fine. Can you hear me?
Yeah, you're sounding
I suppose
good.
you responded already, so that makes sense.
Yeah, this one's got 3 settings, so I use the one that filters out the most background noise for, when I'm doing stuff in front of here.
Yep.
But sometimes that can make it a little bit low,
Hey, totally. Look, it sounds great on this end, and yeah.
Okay.
Well, welcome to it. Welcome to the very first Better Than Food podcast, and it's a pleasure to be talking with you, Greg. I can't wait to discuss some books, man. Very exciting.
Yeah, it'll be a lot of fun.
Yeah, thanks for coming on, man.
Sure.
Yeah, I mean, we can get into it. Essentially, I just wanted to ask you about. I know it's incredibly difficult to narrow down, but yeah, really, the top 3 books that you thought were better than food. The top 3 books throughout your life that really had a tremendous impact and just sort of changed, all the schisms, all the molecular biology, that just that took your whole perspective to a new level for the better.
Yeah, that was really tough, and it's a great sort of assignment to force oneself to go through. I think.
Yeah, totally.
Because at first, a lot of the stuff that you talk about is, you could say, high art, novels and that sort of stuff. And I read plenty of those in my life, and a lot of them did influence me. And so I was thinking, well, which ones? And it was tough sometimes because I could think about authors who I really got into, and then, well, which book would I pick, right? Mm-hmm. And then over a while, as I mulled it over, it shouldn't be a surprise to me given what I do for a living. It turned out to be philosophy books that were the most influential. And it's not that the literature stuff isn't, Borges's Labyrinths, that collection of short stories, for example, was really influential on me.
Oh, yeah.
I remember at a certain time, but somehow those things didn't have as much sticking power on my brain as the 3 books that I eventually settled on are. Mm-hmm. And so should we just say what they are right off the bat? Or?
Well, let's start with number 1. Let's unspool luxuriously. Let's start with the first one, and if you could just give us a little bit of context, like where you were in your life, and what was going on, and how you came across the book, and of course, and then the impact that it had on you, gradually or immediately.
Okay. Well, number 1 is actually Plato's Republic. And all 3 of the works that I picked are from, you could say, from ancient virtue ethics, but they're representing different schools. And I think, actually, if I remember back, it probably was on a reading list for middle school or high school. I went to a private middle school, and then I went to a Catholic high school, so there were usually summer reading things. And, I got put into the AP classes. But I also typically, at that time, didn't take the reading very seriously. I was more into reading history and science fiction stuff. So I imagine if I did encounter it, and I actually did read it back then, it had no impact on me whatsoever. because I wasn't ready for it, you know.
Yeah, of
And
course.
then I know I read it as an undergraduate at Lakeland College when I was a philosophy major. I know I read it several times, and I think there I focused less on the stuff that I pay attention to now in the book, and more just on the discussions about the political system and what's his ideal republic that's being put forward. And if you look at the text carefully, it's not at all clear that that's what Plato is advocating for, that this ideal republic, because he has Socrates early on say, before they launch into that, he has sketches out this kind of very primitive, village-based life, and says those people are going to have it great, and then the people who are having this chat with him, they say, yeah, but what about, relishes for their food and dessert and all these other things that we like? And Socrates, oh, you want the luxurious city. I thought we were just sketching out the city, but you want the luxurious city. And so the ideal city that Plato is actually sketching out is one step removed from whatever that original ideal is. And so it's not clear whether Plato really wants this thing that it got used as fodder for so many sci-fi movies in the 70s, where you got three classes. But what I really like about it, and what keeps drawing me back into it, and a lot of this I only realized as I was teaching it later on as a professor, is that it's setting out a way of thinking about your soul, or if you like, your personality, and what it is that drives you. And it's not a full picture. I think Aristotle is an improvement over this, but this notion that you could think about yourself and think, well, what am I driven by? Am I in it for knowledge? Is that what really turns me on, or is it honor? People looking at me, social status, we might say. That really does drive a lot of people, or is it money, or the things that money can buy, like physical pleasures? And Plato recognizes that not everybody is going to be driven by the desire for knowledge or even honor. He thinks most people are driven by desire for wealth, to have security, to have some comforts and pleasures, and that's about as far as they go. And so there's certain ways in which you're going to make decisions about yourself, and it wouldn't be bad if all of our decisions only bore on ourselves, but you're going to make decisions about other people and what society ought to look like. And, I suppose these days we could say we vote with the media that we consume, if too many people like watching this sort of thing, and it's kind of, mindless, well, that sells. And so there'll be a lot more of the mindless stuff.
Yeah.
So there's, that's really the core for me of what's going on in Plato's Republic. And then this discussion of the different virtues and their corresponding vices, and how they fit in with different parts of our personality. So I'm somebody who my entire life has been driven by a desire for knowledge, but I'm kind of a hybrid person in Plato's view, because I'm also somebody who gets pretty riled up and was very competitive. So I would be that honor-driven person, that second part of the soul that Plato calls thumos, and we translate as spirit or appetite, was always pretty strong in me, still is, quite honestly. And that's the part that gets angry.
Yeah.
So that's how I got into a lot of the anger studies, because I'm somebody who had to deal with my own anger.
Totally. Yeah, we discussed that.
Yeah, so I found there's a lot of resources there, and they're not really, they're sort of like resources to get people thinking, not resources like here's the master plan that will put everything totally into place for you. Like buying a package that has videos and a book and all that other stuff. Right? It's sort of a beginning sketch, but it's really great to start people out on. And I've had so many students who, they'd hear that we were going to study Plato's Republic, and they'd just hear these groans. Oh my God, that stuff, And then they'd start actually reading it and see, getting into the characters and getting into the ideas. and starting. It really clicked when they start seeing how it fits in with their own life, and so for me, that's kind of a starting point. I mean, there's other works by Plato that you can start students off on, but if you're really interested in sort of like doing one of those, I mean, we should almost propose these as like, people do these detox cleanses.
Yeah.
We should have retreats where people go away for a week and they read things like the Republic or Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics.
Oh yeah.
And they don't have their phones on, and they think about this stuff, and after a while, it starts to sink in. Oh my God, my life is such a mess. Socrates would look at me and say, "You poor bastard."
Oh man, we got to do that. I would sign up. I'm sure. I would absolutely pay for that. No, patent pending.
Yeah, that would be a lot of fun.
Yeah, definitely. How old were you when you read it? Do you remember? You might have mentioned.
Oh, so I got in college a little bit late because I went in the Army for a bit before that. So I was probably, I was in my 20s, definitely. I'm willing to bet I didn't read it my first year in college, probably my second year. So I would have been like 21, 22.
Yep.
But, I can't say that I really understood it that well back then.
But you had something. Something was going on.
Yeah. And it was one of those books, too, that when I was in graduate school, other people would read. And so it was a common reference point. So you probably didn't agree with Plato, but you could use analogies. Like, for example, the famous allegory of the cave is in there, right? And so when you're talking about other thinkers, because Plato was so important and because the Republic was so central in his work, it would inevitably come up. But then the other thing that really helped me was when I was a graduate student, we had to take these examinations. I don't know if did I tell you about these before? It's kind of like academic hazing in a way.
Maybe briefly, but we should run through it. Okay.
So a lot of schools have gotten rid of these, in part because they lead to, a lot of anxiety on the part of students, and there's worries about them being unfair. But when comprehensive and preliminary examinations are done well, they really serve an important purpose in education. So the comprehensive was about the history of philosophy. You had to answer questions, and the questions would be drawn from like a pool. Answer one of these three questions about the ancient period, one of these three about medieval philosophy, one of these three about early modern, one of these three about 19th century. And you wouldn't know what they were in advance, but you could see previous tests, and so you could get kind of an idea of the sort of stuff they might ask about, and then they'd give you a reading list. And the reading list was pretty long because we had it was one of those things where everybody wanted to get their people in there, the people that they thought were important. So you might be, for ancient, you might be asked about, 6 or 7 texts of Plato and 3 or 4 by Aristotle. You might be asked about the Stoics or the Skeptics or the Epicureans or Neoplatonists. So there's a lot to cover, and you would read this stuff, and since you got no idea what you're going to be tested on or what you're going to have to answer, you need to understand the whole thing, right? And so that's at the master's level. At the PhD level, you had 4 of these exams. One was on metaphysics and philosophy of religion. One was on epistemology and philosophy of science. One was on what they called value fields, which would be like ethics and aesthetics and politics. And then the 4th was a special thinker. You pick who you want to do your that exam on. And so I picked Hegel. And when I said, well, what should I do to prep? The guy who was more or less in charge said, well, just memorize the whole phenomenology. And some parts of the science of logic too. And so I made this gigantic chart, with all the different dialectics on it. But anyway, so the Plato, right? Plato's Republic showed up in the comps, in the philosophy, in the metaphysics, because you've got all sorts of discussions there, in the epistemology section, and of course in the value fields. So the only thing for that is just basically memorize the Republic too.
Mm-hmm.
And
Easy.
when you hunker down and concentrate on these texts like that, you find it's sort of like being a prisoner in somebody's house, right? You go into somebody's house for a dinner party, and you look around. Oh, you have a lovely house, but you're not going to poke around in their desk drawers and see what's in there,
Right.
or wander around and maybe tap on the walls and see if there's secret passages or anything like that. Now imagine, dinner party's over, you're the last guest, and they say, "Oh, can you just watch the place for me for a second?" And they leave, and suddenly the doors close, and you can't get out. Well, you would explore every single part of that place you could, right?
Yes, sir.
So, yeah, it's this is a bit of a pejorative way to put it, I think, but you find a lot of cool stuff that way, right?
Yeah, of course.
So that was what happened I would have been in my late 20s when I was doing that.
Yeah.
And that really drove it home for me.
Totally. Yeah. Have you reread it over the years and gotten more out of it? Continually?
Yeah. As a matter of fact, it's I mean, you have this experience too when you reread these great texts.
Oh, yeah.
That you may have been looking at them for 20 years, but you find, oh, how the hell did I miss this?
Oh, totally. That's such an amazing feeling. Sometimes it's like a different book if you wait long enough. It's insane.
Yeah, as you age too, that's a function. Provided that aging actually brings maturity. For some people, they remain like a high schooler their whole life, right? So forget them; they're not going to get anything new.
For sure.
But the rest of us, yeah, as you get older, and it's funny too because older people would tell you this sort of stuff, and you're like, nah, that's not going to happen. And sure enough, it does.
Sure enough, it does. It's like magic, man. It's crazy. Yeah. So Plato's Republic, number 1. Fantastic.
Yeah.
I have not read it yet. I'm sad to say I have to
Oh.
get to it. Yes, I must get to it.
You'll enjoy it.
I'm sure I will.
Yeah, and I think the key thing to keep in mind is, it is a dialogue. At least for parts of it. Some of it it's just Socrates talking, and then Glaucon or Adeimantus, these two guys who are actually brothers of Plato, saying, "Yes, Socrates, makes sense. Keep going." But a good part of it, especially like book 1, there's this young guy, Thrasymachus, and Thrasymachus is he's one of these people who's driven by desire for honor. He's what we'd call a young punk nowadays, right?
Yeah, yeah.
But a young punk with a good education, and he comes in, and he's not from Athens. He's from outside, and he's there at the party, which it's taking place at a party, and these guys are discussing justice, and Thrasymachus is a teacher of rhetoric. So he's used to analyzing political regimes and getting people to give speeches, and he's traveled a good bit. So he thinks he knows a lot about the world and about human nature. And, if we were to translate Plato into more contemporary language than the Oxfordy kind of stuff that we usually have with these texts, he would be coming in and saying, "You guys don't know what the hell you're talking about. You're a bunch of dummies. I'll let you know what justice is, but you got to pay me first. But until then, why don't you all shut the hell up?" And so he's representing, what Plato's really good at is having his characters represent the doctrines that they put forward. Thrasymachus thinks that it's all about power and about dominating people, and he behaves that way. And Socrates brings out he points some holes in Thrasymachus' arguments, and he makes some arguments himself, and they're not the best arguments, too. If you look at them carefully, you'd be like, boy, Thrasymachus missed an opportunity to say, wait a second, Socrates, what about this? And Plato will put arguments in there that he knows are not particularly good. And so there's a lot of debate about, well, what's going on there? Is Plato just a dummy? Does he not realize that this is a bad argument? That seems pretty far-fetched, but some people have held that position, and they write a book about why Plato is a dummy,
Oh, wow.
and there's a whole literature of why anybody's a dummy
No,
out there, right?
of course. Yes. Everyone's a critic.
Yeah. Well, and that's the thing. If you want to be a good critic, you actually have to target your opponents where they're strongest, right?
Yep.
And so you can't just take cheap shots.
Absolutely.
So, another way of thinking about it is Plato tailors the arguments that his main mouthpiece, Socrates, or sometimes other characters give to the capacity of the person they're talking with. Mm-hmm. So you don't, if you're chatting with people on the bus, you don't necessarily bring out your best material and arguments with some guy who's huffing in a paper bag, right?
Sure. Oh, I do every time, Greg.
Oh, yeah. Must make for interesting bus rides.
Oh, absolutely, my friend. I got some stories from LA buses, I'll tell you. Oh, man. Yeah.
I used to ride the Greyhound when I was a graduate student up from Carbondale to Milwaukee, and we'd have to change in Chicago.
Oh, yeah.
Boy, was that eye-opening.
Oh, I bet.
I'd been on Greyhounds, like when I had to take trips in the Army. But, the first stop after Carbondale on that particular route is Marion, where there's a federal penitentiary.
Yep.
And so these guys, I'd be going home for Thanksgiving. Well, these guys would be getting out on furlough for Thanksgiving.
Yep.
And just about every time there'd be at least one of them would get thrown off the bus. They'd start smoking in the back of the bus, and the bus driver would get ticked off. And the bus driver would tell them to stop, and they'd tell them to go to hell.
Yep.
And pull it over. State troopers would come, pull a guy off the bus.
No big deal. Just a daily thing.
Yeah.
No big deal, man. No, I got crazy stories from over here. My friend was going back from Beverly Hills to downtown Los Angeles one night, and this woman got on the bus, and she rolls down the window in the back, and she starts smoking, and she's acting very, very strange, totally on something. And when she gets up to leave, the final finale is that she's pregnant when she gets off the bus. Just absolutely insane. Some scary stuff on there, dude.
Yeah.
And but yeah, I mean, common occurrence in Los Angeles. But how did we get from Plato to that? Plato to crazy bus rides. Yeah, man. Do you have any advice on for young people getting into books? Do you have any advice for them? When they're just starting out trying to tackle these big texts.
Well, so I would say with these sorts of things, it's good to just try to plow through it the first time and don't worry so much about having to take notes or underlining, right? Because you'll end up underlining everything on the page, and that doesn't do any good, because the whole purpose of that is to pick out what needs to be preserved from what you can forget. And I would say with Plato, with dialogues, just read them all the way through. And then come back to it, and you'll have lots of questions where you're like, I don't know what the hell he was talking about here. I better go back over this. And the other thing to realize too is there's going to be a lot of back and forth, references, sort of like in a novel. It's not a systematic piece of philosophy where Plato says, okay, here's my starting points. Now I'm going to deduce things from these. Instead, the discussion meanders. There's actually some digressions kind of built into it. Just go with the flow with that. It takes a while to get used to it, and don't feel bad if you don't get everything right away. I've been reading it for, it'd be about close to 30 years now, and I can't say that I've gotten everything out of the text myself. The other thing too that I'll say is people always ask me about translations. And I'm not a really great giver of advice, in part because I read it in the Greek. Now, I read it more often in English, but I'm a lazy English reader because I can always go to the Greek if I ever get bogged down. If I remember, I wonder what exactly is going on in that passage.
Yeah.
I just, I go to the original text. And so, if I spent a lot of time and like compared the translations, I could say, well, this is a better translation than this translation.
Hmm.
But since I don't do that sort of work, I'm actually worse at saying who's a good translator than maybe somebody who's only got English.
Right.
But that said, I will say this: Hackett Publishing Company is a good place to go for philosophy stuff because they tend to get good translators, and they're cheap.
Awesome.
Yeah, they're a press out of Indianapolis. You see them in a lot of college
Mm.
classes
Hmm.
from professors who take mercy on their students and don't, rack up the book bill to like $200 a
Yeah,
class,
for sure.
you know. So usually, that's the way to go. And they often have like end of the year sales or things
Hmm.
like that. So stock up on your philosophy books then.
Excellent. So you read Greek?
Yeah, I actually read Greek, Latin, German, and French.
Oh man.
Um, and I translate from Latin and French. Um, I've done a bit of German translation. When I do my own sort of scholarly work on say Aristotle or the Stoics, then I will usually provide my own translations. But I'm looking to other people's translations and saying, okay, how did they translate this passage? Do I want to change anything from that? Like maybe the word choice needs to be a little bit more modern or colloquial for me. Um, so you get into the habit of just supplying your own translations for things.
Yeah, totally. That's fantastic. That's extremely useful. How long did it take you for each language, and which was the most difficult? Just out of
Um,
curiosity.
well, the Greek I think for me was the most
Most
difficult.
difficult. Yeah.
Um, I had an advantage in that I come from a family that was originally French Canadian,
Oh, okay.
and
Gotcha.
but they'd been in the States for a couple generations. But my mom grew up in Chicago speaking French before English,
Oh, wow.
and so in my generation, most of the kids didn't learn French, but I did. I learned just colloquial stuff,
Sure.
and it's not exactly even like good Quebecois French. It's kind of a hillbilly version of that
That's awesome.
that they're speaking. But all the older people, like my grandparents' generation, most of them spoke more French than English. A lot of them were from Quebec because they would, bring spouses from from Quebec, and so then, that whole bunch of my mom's cousins, they all would speak French with the older people. So if you wanted to know what was going on, it helped to know. And so then my mom made me take French classes when I was in middle school and in high school, and I totally blew it off, because something I was forced to do, and I think I was kind of uh, I wasn't interested in my
Hmm.
heritage back then.
Hmm.
But I think some of it's probably stuck. And then
Yeah.
when I went to college, they knew that I spoke some French, and they're doing this new language program.
Mm.
So they had these instead of like being in the regular dorms, they would put you in a suite, and you're supposed to like be speaking French all the time. That never
Mm.
panned out, but they'd have like a native speaker from France in there. So they had a French house, and a German house, and a Japanese house. That one totally failed, and a Spanish house. And so that again, I had to take a French class, and this time I kind of hunkered down to finally learn the actual grammar instead of how it is with English, right? I mean,
Sure.
we speak English, but it couldn't hurt us to have a grammar class,
Oh, oh,
or
without a
learn
doubt.
more vocabulary.
Most
Um,
definitely.
so then after that, I just started reading a lot of French literature, and it was the 90s, and French separatism in Quebec was kind of on the rise,
Yep.
and I got caught up in that, and so studying French philosophy in French was a way to kind of stick it to the Anglos, uh,
There you go.
you know, and it all turned out on my part. I'm not denigrating people who are more serious about this, but it
No,
all
yeah.
turned out on part to be kind of nonsense.
Yeah.
But I came out of it, having read a lot of French philosophy, and
Hey.
then the German I taught myself. I'd been in Germany as a soldier, so I'd learned some very rudimentary German. And then when I was back here, I found a teach yourself German book from the late 1800s in my uncle's
Oh man,
study.
nice.
And so I started doing that and worked through the entire book while I was a security guard on third shift, not far from here,
There
in
you go.
between college and
That
university.
is a great
And,
use of time. I just got to say, that is a brilliant use of time. If you're going to do that, then that is magnificent.
well, the best thing about it is getting somebody else to pay for your time, right?
Yeah,
Doing it on
yeah.
company time.
Sure, sure,
So,
sure. Exactly.
um, but it was kind of funny because I did learn to read the old script, which is cool because they don't teach that to younger Germans because the Nazis used it. So they kind of
Really?
ruined it for everybody.
Oh wow. I didn't
Yeah.
know that. That's fascinating. They
Yeah,
were
so there's lots of old German books that are in the script that the younger people can't read. It's called the Fraktur.
Whoa.
Yeah,
Really? That's
yeah,
nuts.
yeah.
Holy
So
shit.
they just throw them out,
They
and then
ruined
I would
everything.
yeah, pretty much.
Dude.
Yeah, well, this is a total digression, but
Oh
think
yeah.
about our current political, woes and all the arguments back and forth, and how quickly it turns. Well, that person's Hitler.
Well, that person's
Um,
Hitler. Oh yes.
it doesn't take any time at all,
No.
because I mean, Hitler breathed air. So if my opponent was breathing air, you
He's
know,
practically Hitler, Greg.
exactly,
Practically Hitler. He's breathing.
yeah. So
Oh yeah.
yeah, so and I picked up Latin in a kind of similar way. I, uh, I found an Army field manual for JAG officers. We used to call them the JAG-offs, actually.
That's good.
And
Is it bad? That's
there's
where
a
my
lot of
mind went.
there's a lot of sort of rivalry between the officer corps and the enlisted people
Yeah.
in the Army, which I think is good actually. But so I studied that, and then I said, okay, well now it's time since I finished this course to do some reading. So I went and I got some Cicero from the library, and I spent the whole semester just trying to read 10 pages, and I was like, this is beyond me. I need to back up and start again. So I went and I was like, well, what do the people who are studying Latin use? There was a grammar that they had, the Allen and Greeno. It's a big, thick, book, and it's full of all sorts of examples. So I bought that, and I over the course of a year, I just went through the entire grammar and went through all of the examples, and by the time that I finished, I was ready for reading some more stuff. And then I started out with easier stuff like Thomas Aquinas. And then the Greek I actually did the right way. I took classes. And we started out with 12 students at the beginning of the first semester. We finished with 4. And then we started with those 4 the next semester, and there were only 2 of us left after that. And then we went on to the reading parts, and you do an entire semester reading Plato's Symposium or Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics or Herodotus, his histories of the Persian Wars, and that was tough work, but it was good to do. It was a lot of fun, and I can't say that you get kind of lazy after a while when you're working with particular authors. You know their vocabulary and the way that they're using the language very well, but it's not like you could just drop a Greek text in front of me and I would automatically open it up. Oh yeah, here's what's going on.
Sure.
Yeah.
It's fantastic though. I mean, it's I have to. I'm limited to English, and that absolutely has to change. So that you're an inspiration. That's incredible. But
Yeah, and they try to tell you this nonsense that only kids can learn languages. Well, no, and
it's
anybody
bullshit.
can.
That's good.
Oh yeah. You just got to put in an hour a day.
Excellent.
Just like exercise.
Just like exercise. There we go. We got to do it. We should all strive to do both. Should strive to do both of those more. But
yeah. I will mention though, I've tried and failed when it comes to some languages as well, part by not making enough effort.
Oh yeah.
So I've made a number of attempts to learn Mandarin.
Oh wow. Yeah.
And I mean, at one time I knew I could read and write about 200 characters, and I could carry on exchanges, about pretty low level stuff.
Yeah.
But I didn't keep up with it. I tried learning Portuguese,
Hmm.
which I really like as a language, but um, I never made much progress with that.
Yep.
Again, not enough effort.
Yep.
You got to do it an hour a day and just stick with it.
We went to Budapest, my girlfriend and I, and we took one look at Hungarian and just immediately gave up. We had no, just because it's like, unlike a lot of the Romance languages, there's just no basis. I mean, it's like,
Well, it's not even an Indo-European language.
yeah, I mean, we had no clue what was
Yeah.
going on. And it was beautiful, but it was completely other. So maybe one day, but far down the line.
Yeah.
Okay, so book two. No,
Okay, so yeah, book number 2 would be Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics.
Nicomachean
And
Ethics.
so Aristotle's written a lot of works, or at least fortunately we have a lot of works that he wrote. I think we have about maybe half of what he wrote. One of the great tragedies of ancient culture is that we have so little by many of the authors who we have like lists. Well, this guy wrote these 17 books, and we don't have anything by them.
Oh man, yeah,
Just tantalizing titles,
yep,
None of them are like the book that would make sense of everything for you, but some of them are kind of close. So Aristotle, yeah, he, there's other people that are really into Aristotle, and they get into like the politics or the metaphysics or some of his other works, and I like those. But the Nicomachean Ethics for me is always sort of like the one I keep going back to, and it's the one that I've taught the most too because of that. And he's doing some of the same stuff that Plato was doing in the Republic. Not so much about the political system, but a lot about the human person and what drives us, and how do we progress towards becoming better people, or away from being miserable bastards,
Right.
That we start out as.
yeah,
And so you can use it in the same sort of self-transformative way. And people have all these self-help books that are out there, and those are sometimes very useful. They can be the right thing at the right time for a particular person.
oh yeah,
But you really want some sort of substantive grounding, some sort of basis that makes sense, other than whatever you put out in the universe comes back to you. That's
Right.
not a philosophy.
Right, of course.
That's like the very beginning of a philosophy.
Right.
You want something, that
Substantial.
and something that can also withstand the fact that not everything that you put out in the universe does come back to you. Things are more complicated than that. And so Aristotle was an interesting guy too, because at first when I read him, I thought he was stupid. The text that we start people out on usually, that I read first, is the Categories. I'm actually shooting some videos about that right now.
oh great,
Yeah, in part because my experience as a student was reading it, and parts of it just were incomprehensible. I couldn't figure, and very early on, like the second chapter, which means essentially like the third paragraph of the work, I was already hitting points where I have no clue what's being talked about here, And then other parts they seemed so commonsensical. I was like, why did anyone write this stuff down, and why do I have to read this? But as I spent more time, with Aristotle, a lot of these things, I saw how deep and systematic his analyses of human nature, and how we use language, and all sorts of other related topics were. And so I developed a real appreciation. The other thing that for me really helped out was, again, reading Greek. When I would read Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics, and I would read, say, the Rhetoric or the Politics or other works, they usually weren't translated by the same people. And so the English translations, Aristotle might be using the same term for the same concept across the works, but you wouldn't realize that because some poli-sci guy translated the Politics, and he translated that term this way. some philosopher translated the ethics this way, and some Rhet Comp person translated the rhetoric this way.
Oh,
so
man.
once you can see the connections between the texts and what's being talked about, it opens up a whole world.
Yeah.
And Aristotle tells you, hey, at the end of the Nicomachean Ethics, hey, we're going to move into the politics text, right? Because that's. But a lot of people don't pay attention to that. So they read it just as a kind of hermetically sealed work. And you can get something out of it doing that, I think. But you get more when you put it into the context. And but even just the Nicomachean Ethics by itself, it's got so many cool discussions. He devotes 2 whole books, or what we would call chapters, out of the 10 that comprise it, to the nature of friendship and relationships, and how we can distinguish them from each other, and whether good people can be friends with bad people, or should we come to the aid of friends when they're in need? All these sorts of interesting questions.
Things we're still asking today, all the time.
Yeah. I think that's kind of an important point too. So why keep reading these books? Because human nature, we probably know a bit more about it, aided by, say, psychology and some other empirical studies, but it hasn't fundamentally changed.
Right.
And
right.
The things that they were interested in, friendship, how angry should I get, what's right and what's wrong, hey, those aren't going to go away.
Yeah.
And they're not going to be absolutely resolved. And the reason why they're not resolved is because it's not as if there aren't, actual answers to these questions, but they're answers that require that you engage in some moral development of your own before you're ready to hear the answers.
Right.
So Aristotle and Plato give us some of the tools for that moral development to take place.
Brilliant.
Yeah. Well, and that's the other kind of cool thing too. So it sounds brilliant when I'm saying it, but it's not brilliant because I'm saying it.
Right.
Its brilliance is borrowed brilliance, because it's coming from these texts. I'm sort of, I mentioned this to you before. I'm sort of like a salesman who's just got some of the best products to sell. So you come into if I can get you to come into the showroom, I can probably sell you some Plato or Aristotle or Epictetus, because I'll let you get inside and take it for a test drive and see how well it handles the corners and all that. Once I get you in, the product kind of sells itself.
Oh man, but you're so much better than a car salesman. This is so much better than a Ferrari. Without a doubt.
you gotta know your product. That's the thing.
Yeah, there
right?
you go.
You got to know your product, and you actually have to. I suppose it's also sort of like that hair club appeal, right? The guy, I'm not just the president, I'm also a client, he says. Right? So if you could say, hey, like you get somebody coming in, right, and they're dealing with grief, and so I might, when I'm dealing with my clients, I might have them read some of Cicero, because Cicero, he had a daughter who he was very close to die. And some of what he was doing in writing his philosophy stuff was trying to fill up the time that was just inhabited by this pall of grief. There was that going on, and then like the whole Roman Republic had gone to crap.
Yeah, right.
Caesar's in charge. The guy who was marginally better than Caesar, Pompey, lost horribly. So he writes about grief in this book called the Tusculan Meditations, or Disputation, sorry. And so I might, if somebody's coming and they're struggling with grief, I might have them read that, and then it might take a bit of dialogue. What do you think about this? How would you apply this? What's he talking about here? But there, all I'm doing is educating people about what he's saying, because he's got some really great stuff.
Totally. Yeah. Where were you at when you read this one as well?
Oh, you mean the Cicero or the Aristotle?
The Aristotle. Yeah. Where were you at in your life?
Oh, so I read Aristotle as a philosophy major, and I think I would have probably read him like my first semester there.
Yep.
So I'd be like 20 years old, and like I said, I had a bad reaction.
Right. What caused you to come back and revisit it? Was it something somebody said, or?
Oh, yeah. So I'd say it was three things. One was, and I think this is really important.
Yeah.
For not my case in particular, but how we figure out who's worth reading.
Yeah, most definitely. We should talk about that.
When we see people who we think are reasonable or cool or interesting or well put together, and they're saying you need to read so and so, and you're like, I've read so and I think they're crap. If they keep on with that enough, then eventually, if we're fairly reasonable, we'll say there must be something to it that I missed, right?
Yeah.
And so with Aristotle, that was a big part of it. I had some good friends as other grad students who were like, you're really you don't like the Aristotle stuff, but I don't think you've really grasped it. Maybe if you read it again, you'll get something more out of it. And it's that way with a lot of things. I think this is why people, they look for book recommendations. And if you think about what you're doing, I mean, you're doing a lot of book recommendations.
Yeah.
And you go quite in depth into here's what's going on, here's why I think it's a great work. You're relying in part on what Aristotle in the Nicomachean ethics, in the rhetoric, calls ethos. You've built up a kind of reliability as a recommender, right? And it's based on the perception of character traits. So you can extend that more broadly. If we don't really know somebody, think about the New York Times bestsellers list, right? Stuff is on there, and I look at that and I'm like, well, okay, that's what people are reading, but I don't know I would actually want to read any of that stuff.
It's a great point.
But if somebody who I respect says this is really worth reading, then I will try to make time for it usually.
Totally.
So there was that, and then there was the experience of the prelims, and the comps, having to read the stuff and memorize it. I actually memorized some of Aristotle's passages in the Greek for some of the prelims, and then put them down as I was writing the answer. And I remember one of the professors came up to me afterwards, and he was a guy who taught Plato, so he could read Greek as well. And he gave me a high pass on the exam, but he said, if you're going to put the stuff down in Greek, you really need to get the accents right. It's just kind of ribbing me about it.
Little slight there, yeah. That's good.
And then so I said there were three things. Now I'm just trying to remember. So other people, the comps. Oh yeah. So reading across the texts and being able to see the connections between the Nicomachean ethics and the rhetoric and the politics and all these other. That deepens the experience. Same thing with Plato too. When you read the Republic, the Republic's great, but when you also read other Platonic texts, that will make it much more of a valuable experience.
Good to know. Excellent. Yeah. Excellent. Okay, so I suppose we should go into our third and final book. Although this kind of, it's the three, but there's a dialogue between all of these, and so there's titles kind of coming in and out here, which people should definitely take note of, which will be great. But well, actually, maybe before we go into those two, into the final one, are there any supplementary texts for the Republic and Aristotle that you would recommend picking up to help out?
Yeah, see, I'm a bad one for that as well, because it's in part a factor of time. The more that I work on content production, you're in the same boat. The more you work on content production, the less time you have for actual reading and study.
Yes, sir. Yes.
24 hours a day, right?
Absolutely.
And I myself, I have this sort of thing of, well, if I'm going to read stuff with Plato, should I read the Plato or should I read secondary literature? And I will sometimes read secondary literature, but it's usually if I'm interested in writing an academic piece about this particular issue, or if somebody's recommended a book and said, "Oh, this is really, really good. You need to read so and so's new article or book about Plato." And so I'm a bad recommender because I'm lazy in that respect.
Hey, no, that's no problem. I mean, it may be better in some senses to just kind of like dive in and just get to it and just keep rereading.
That's a good sort of segue into a little soapbox thing.
Yeah.
Anybody can read Plato. Anybody can read Aristotle. It's a matter of being willing to sort of like push past. It's sort of like saying anybody can walk with exercise. I don't want to trivialize Plato or Aristotle and say that they're easy or anything, but I've seen so many students who came into my classroom and they had kind of a built-in inferiority complex with respect to these classic texts.
Totally.
I mean, you probably see this with a lot of the stuff
all the time.
that you're,
Yeah.
So people don't realize it's probably because they've had teachers or other people telling them that they're not smart enough to read this stuff.
It has an aura, which I'm sure you're totally aware of. It's intimidating.
Yeah, but most people turn out to be up to the task. So I think that's an important point to stress.
Yeah, totally. Kind of like the language is just putting in the time, just like getting in there. That's awesome.
Yeah.
That's fantastic. Yeah, I mean that's what I think we're aiming to do is to just like you can read difficult texts, you can read difficult philosophy and literature, you can really get in there, and you should.
Yeah.
So
if you think about what our channels are doing, so you're introducing people to you're very productive. So you're introducing people to a wide spectrum of some classic literature, a lot of contemporary literature. People wouldn't ordinarily encounter. I would imagine most of the people watching.
Yeah.
And you're giving them you're not just giving them some of the tools to go to the text. You're probably giving them some confidence about their capacity. If they can understand you talking about it, then the reasoning process is, then I can go to the text and read it, and it won't be so, like you're saying, intimidating.
Yeah,
right?
so daunting. I fundamentally believe that. I mean, I think a lot of it's about attitude, which I'm sure you can totally get. And just risking not knowing what you're reading at first. I mean, it's like it's okay.
Oh yeah.
I mean, that's exciting, man. That's like the spice of life. It's like especially when you get little moments that kind of just rise to the surface, and then the big one hits, and then you're like, oh. Well, now I'm changed as a human being in my entire, which I've had those days.
There's that old idea of the book reading the reader.
The
reader in the process.
Yeah,
I suppose when it comes to philosophy books, people probably have a bit more of if I'm putting the time in this and taking the risk of reading it, I have to be getting something tangible out of it that I can, say to somebody else, or else I've totally wasted my time. And it's unfortunate. It'd be interesting to see where these ideas that people have about that come from.
Yeah, definitely. That's something to explore, or maybe something to move past. Hopefully.
Yeah.
I mean, that's the idea.
Well, so going back to these like Plato and Aristotle, and we're going to talk Epictetus next.
Mm-hmm.
There's a connection between moving past something and exploring it. In order to, this is why they're useful for philosophical counseling and coaching and stuff like that. In order to resolve something or to improve your life in a certain way, you got to understand what's screwed up. And superficial understandings of what's screwed up tend to be more counterproductive, because people try to engage in new choices or actions based on those superficial understandings, and then they introduce new problems, right? The idea is that so like let's say for example something I do a lot of work on is anger, right? Plato, Aristotle, Epictetus, each of them talks about anger, and they talk about it in somewhat different ways. So Epictetus thinks anger is never good. Aristotle thinks sometimes it's appropriate to be angry, but you got to really watch it, because it's really easy to get angry with the wrong people or to the wrong amount or sometimes over nothing. And if you come from a family or an educational background or a work background where you're just not allowed to express anger once you get angry, that's gonna cause problems because you're gonna get angry. Mm-hmm. And then what do you do with that anger? After a while, you start getting these habits that the ancients called vices. These are habitual patterns of not just behaving, but also thinking and feeling. And so, like we'll take, for example, scapegoating and bullying, right? You're not allowed to get angry in the workplace, except at this thing over here. And then you get to have your, we'll make it super extreme, right? You get to have your Orwellian 2-minute hate, directed at these people. And you're just a total mess psychologically, right?
Yeah.
So, somebody else might come along and say, well, don't do that anymore. Just be calm and don't be angry. And you see people, oh yeah, that sounds great. And now we'll go to yoga class and, say namaste and be nice to each other. And I mean, the joke is that people are, in the parking lot saying, namaste, asshole, to each other.
Totally.
And so, you move from one counterproductive way of being to another one. Or, then sometimes people are like, oh, what you really need to do is just express your anger. You got to get it out there. This is like what was popular in the 70s. You got to learn how to express it so it doesn't eat you up. Well, no, there's a lot of times when it's a terrible idea, and not just prudentially because you're going to lose your job, but it's bad for you as a person to indulge yourself in that. And so, if you read, say, Aristotle or Epictetus, Plato not quite so much, but those two, they give you all sorts of great ways of understanding, well, what is anger? First, before you start worrying about getting rid of it or redirecting it, figure out what the hell it is so that you know what you're working with. And you're not just, shooting blind, you might say. And then, you look at how your habits are slowly changed and how they interfere with your own freedom, or, what other things you desire, or how they impact relationships. And Aristotle and Epictetus help you look at that as well. And so, going back to that idea, in order to change yourself towards what you'd like to be, you have to have a diagnosis of how things are screwed up, and not just a name for it, but an understanding of it. And that's what these classic virtue ethicists provide us with.
That's fantastic.
That's why I find them useful. I mean, I find it, again, like the Hair Club for Men.
Yeah.
I found them extremely useful for me.
Yeah, totally.
That's why I kept working on them.
Yeah. That's why I recommend the books that I do. But I mean, do you also you do philosophical counseling? Can you talk a little bit about that? That's very interesting.
Sure. Yeah. So it's sometimes also called philosophical practice, and it makes sense. The idea is that philosophy is not just about having ideas and discussing the ideas, but that it applies to our lives, and that was at the core of philosophy as it was practiced in ancient times, and actually all the way through the Middle Ages and into the early modern period. And so there's resources that are useful that can be drawn from philosophy that wind up getting lost in the popular culture and sometimes rediscovered by psychologists or other people doing more empirically and statistically related research. There's constant stuff of them rediscovering something that the philosophers have known for 2,000 years, and they just happen to have figured it out in an empirical way now. So what I do is I work with clients one-on-one, although you can also do it in group settings. Good bit of it is sort of dialogue. You're doing some of the same stuff that you would do with any counseling or coaching thing. You got to figure out what's motivating this person, what their history is, what sort of assumptions they have. A lot of my work tends to be with the emotions, and with sort of figuring out how to get one's life back on track. We don't ever talk about like being cured or anything, right? Because you don't really get cured of being human.
Death. No.
Well, that cures it, yeah.
Yeah, it's
But
a good cure.
the cure is worse. Cure is worse than the disease, then,
Yes,
right?
sir.
And so it's a lot of it has to do with what we call the virtue of prudence or practical wisdom, figuring out, because there's no rules. There's no like rules that apply across the board for this. There are some, clear ethical guidelines. Don't get financially involved with your clients in say business ventures. Terrible idea, right? I mean, that would apply to any professional, I think. Yeah, so you work with them and you try to help them become more autonomous, be able to decide for themselves where they want to go with their life. You're using resources from philosophy, and sometimes you got to make judgment calls about. I think reading Sartre might be useful for this person, but would be a terrible idea for this person who really needs to read some Epictetus. That reading it and talking about it's called bibliotherapy, and it's interesting. You might have done some of this sort of stuff on your own with other people in talking about literature. I was doing this for years in an unofficial way with students and with colleagues and other people, where I would say, well, Aristotle had something to say about the issue that you're facing. Here's what he had to say. Do you think this might help you? And so I'd been doing that for a while, and I knew that there was this sort of certification process out there. And my wife, who's in many cases the person who kind of pushes me to do things because I'm much more risk averse, she's much more entrepreneurial, said, well, you should go do the training. And so I did, got certified and started working with clients. And I was like, wow, I love doing this. This is great.
There you go.
And it's in part because, again, the teaching is good. I like teaching. I like doing the content production. But doing that one-on-one work is really interesting. Getting to know a person and seeing them grow, by using these voices from the past. It's really rewarding, and it's at the core of what philosophy was. At least the people that I'm interested in, what it was about.
Yeah.
It's not just about ideas and books. It's about how we live our lives.
Absolutely. And that can move us into the third text here. Epictetus, was it?
Yeah, so Epictetus's Discourses. And they're not actually written by Epictetus. They were written by a student of his named Arius, who was a historian and a military commander and a pretty cool guy. And he thought that what Epictetus was teaching in his late years, when Epictetus really had his stuff down, was so valuable that he should write it down. And he wrote down 8 books worth. So a book is a scroll, right? 8 scrolls worth of stuff. And we still have 4 of those left. And they're amazing stuff. So it's not, and they're not organized in any sort of like, here's the chapter, here's all the chapters on friendship, or here's all the chapters on the emotions. It's kind of, haphazard. So you got to do a lot of piecing stuff together. But it provides this really deep, rich articulation of Stoic philosophy. It's way better than the shorter book that a lot of people read, the Enchiridion, which is sort of a little short best hits set of selections from the Discourses, including from some of the Discourses that we've lost. So it's good to have. And Epictetus does the same sort of thing that Aristotle and Plato were doing. He gives you a lot of the tools for figuring out, what's going on with you and whether you think it's good or bad, and how to understand, what human nature is about, and what would be better for you, and then how to move towards that. And I think, in some ways, you could read it like, well, look, either you pick Epictetus or you pick Aristotle or you pick Plato. I don't see them as, they're, on some points they are in opposition, like anger, right? Epictetus does think anger is never good. Aristotle thinks sometimes it's good. Plato thinks it's great because you got to have that thumotic thing in order to control the appetites. So there are some points on which they disagree, but they can be used really well in conjunction with each other. They're thinking through the same sorts of issues. How do we change our habits? How do we even figure out what our habits are? How do we figure out what we're bringing to the situation and what we're responsible, as opposed to other people imposing on us? Because a lot of people, would like to say, "Oh, no, I'm a good person. I'm just in bad circumstances."
Of course, we all would, right? That's the whole thing. Yeah. So these, like you said, these problems have been going on for quite a long time. Kind of stepping outside of yourself and understanding that, I mean, it's all on you.
Yeah.
Like ultimately. So
with Epictetus, I had read the Enchiridion as an undergrad. And, I thought it was interesting. It kind of appealed to the side of me that liked the lowercase Stoic thing of not showing emotions and being a tough guy and all that
Sure.
sort of stuff. But I also didn't like you need to develop yourself morally as a person. I was like, I don't know about that in my early 20s.
Yeah.
And then I happened to find a copy of the Discourses in a really old translation. And it was in a used bookstore that I used to go to near campus in grad school. And as I was reading through it, I was like, wow, this is Epictetus? Holy crap, this guy talked about way more than I understood him as talking about. This is deep stuff,
Yeah.
And I kept on with it, and it's been something I've been going back to over and over again. I do a lot of work on Epictetus now, particularly since I've been involved with the Stoicism Today project. He's probably my favorite Stoic philosopher. I like Seneca, I like Marcus Aurelius, but I like Epictetus the most. So he was a brilliant thinker. Started out in terrible circumstances. He was a slave, dragged off to Rome with this guy Epictetus, who was like a buddy with Nero. And so while Seneca was advising Nero, Epictetus was studying Stoic philosophy with this guy Musonius Rufus as a slave, and then eventually he gets freed, starts teaching in Rome, and then after Nero, this other emperor came around and kicked all the philosophers out.
Oh man.
The Romans had kind of a love-hate thing with philosophy for a while.
Yeah.
And so if you were going to teach philosophy, they'd kill you. So he goes back and moves back to the Greek-speaking world and sets up a school and just makes a living teaching. Not a great living. He lived pretty simply, and lived his whole life there. He was visited by one of the later Roman emperors, Hadrian, and some pretty important people studied with him.
Yeah.
So he clearly, they were impressed with him. But yeah, he's a great thinker, well worth spending time on. He will be, the same thing I can say about Aristotle. When you're reading him at first, you'll be like, boy, this guy strays from the point a lot. I wish he would just stick to this and tell me just about this topic. But it's because all of these, other things are connected up in moral theory. So you can't really talk about your patterns of choice without also talking about human freedom and what really is freedom and what isn't freedom, and how we get mistaken beliefs about things and what's really good for us and what only looks good for us. All these things are kind of tied together.
Yeah.
It's sort of like listening to music, right? You listen to classical music when you're not really that exposed to it, and you're like, just sounds like strings all the time. I can't figure out why am I listening to this? I mean, there's the trumpets every once in a while, but it's very repetitive. you know. But you do it long enough, and you could kind of figure out what's going on. You know?
Yep. Yes. We were talking before a little bit about Hegel and how maybe perhaps he's not the greatest writer, and
It's terrible.
I mean, it's like I wanted to know, it's a very interesting comment because it's like, how do you decipher, or how are you able to kind of like make that judgment when you're approaching these texts? Like, it's like, okay, but then at the same time recognize that there's something really crucial in that writing, even if it is
Yeah.
a pain to get through.
Well, I think with Hegel, it's probably in large part that first thing that we talked about with other people saying, "Oh, you really need to read this," right?
Mm.
And there's a risk with that of it being sort of the emperor not wearing any clothes and everybody just
Yeah,
agreeing with. I think
totally.
there's a lot of contemporary authors that get, people say, "Oh, you got to read this guy. He's so profound,"
Yeah,
you know,
yeah.
and it turns out when you read it, you're like, "This is just fluff," And sometimes it happens too, is you read it when you're young and you read stuff into it. You were doing the work, and then you read it when you're
Yeah,
older and you're like, "This is crap."
yeah, totally.
As a matter of fact, I'll mention something like that in terms of science fiction.
Please.
So Michael Moorcock, who I still like some stuff by him. When I was a teenager, I read the Cornelius Chronicles. And these are these books set in the 60s and 70s and early 80s, where this Jerry Cornelius, who's kind of an anti-hero, rock and roll type, he's having all these adventures, and it's sometimes saving the world, sometimes destroying it. All these time things are sort of colliding with each other. And I was, I remember sitting and reading these books cover to cover, listening to, I don't even remember what I was listening to at the time. I was listening to like Van Halen's Diver Down and
Yeah.
Women and Children, sitting on the couch, in the hot summer, in like the, June, out of school.
There you go.
And so there was all this, and then I reread them later in my 20s, and I was still getting into them. And I've been doing this series on Worlds of Speculative Fiction. It's a talk series I do at one of the local libraries. And so I would take science fiction and fantasy and sometimes horror authors from my past who I remember enjoying, and I'd reread their stuff and then talk about some of the philosophical themes. So like we did Frank Herbert's Dune universe, or Isaac Asimov's Foundation Galaxy. We did Tolkien. We did George R.R. Martin. We're actually doing the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy this month.
Nice.
And with almost all of the people, going back to it and rereading it was rewarding. With Moorcock, I didn't like it so much. It just seemed kind of a lot of it seemed kind of facile, and I understand why it was. I understand what he was trying to do, at the time, but I was like, this just isn't really that good.
That's a flip side of we were discussing reading at various points of your life, and I'm really terrified of that because I mean it's happened quite a few times with films. For me,
that's because
like,
that's because you have a lot more of that ahead of you because you're a younger guy.
Well, I mean, I can sense it like creeping up already. I go back to some text and I was like, yeah, man, this was great. I'm totally gonna review this. Whoa.
Yeah.
Which
what
is
do you
sad.
What do you do in those cases? Do you do the review still, or do you say, I don't really not into it. I'm not going to do it.
If there's something more pressing, I hold it off and I move to the next one. But yeah, nothing lately has come to mind. But I wonder as I grow older if I missed out on certain books or in certain films, because I certainly did on some films. I think like if I watch it now, I'd just be far too critical. My walls are far too. I don't know. You become more closed as a you develop your tastes, and it's like I like this, not this.
Yep.
And so it's like, man,
I'll give you an example of that.
Please.
That's kind of funny. So I grew up in the 70s and 80s, and out here in the Midwest, by the mid '80s, we actually weren't expecting to finish high school. The tensions were pretty high between the East and West blocks, and we had some stuff that didn't turn into anything big, like Libya and its line of death and bombing them. Um, so when Red Dawn came out, that we saw that in the theater and we're like, holy shit, that could happen.
Yeah.
I mean, it was a little implausible that the Cubans and Nicaraguans would be coming up and being part of the occupation force, but we really got into it. And I was I didn't intend to go to college. I was planning on going into the Army as a kid anyway.
Right.
And so were a lot of the people that I hung out with. And going back to it, going back to it and seeing it as an adult, it's really not that good of a movie. and it's interesting to watch.
Yeah.
But it's almost like watching it as a historical piece, rather than you can't get into it the way that you did back then.
Yeah, totally. And
actually, I'll tell you. You want to hear kind of a little funny trivia?
Yeah.
So they remade Red Dawn, right? And one of the reasons why the movie flopped was they had to change it from being Chinese occupiers to North Korean occupiers, which is totally unbelievable. And the reason they had to change it was because the Chinese, once they found out that this is going to happen, they're like, you cannot do this movie. You can't release this way.
Yeah.
So I was in Detroit when it was being shot.
Whoa.
And I was there for a conference. So I was downtown and, walking out of the hotel. And they had these giant Chinese propaganda posters. They had like part of the city kind of cordoned off, and so there'd be a tank behind a bunch of sandbags, like in a sort of firing position over there. And I saw all these Americans, right, but mocked up as Chinese soldiers marching past, and it was kind of interesting. And they had to set off some charges in the middle of the night because they were filming at night. It was a night scene.
Right.
And it was maybe 6 blocks from the hotel, and they set off the charge. And I knew what was going on, but it provoked a panic in the hotel.
Oh man, they didn't tell
And
them.
so I was kind of excited to see the new one come out because I was like, yeah, it's going to be. I saw part of the filming, and it looked pretty cool. And then to find out that no, it's first it's going to be delayed, and then they said it's going to be delayed, and now it's the North Koreans, and I was like, I'm not even going to bother with this.
Yeah, totally. Totally. Do you think your time in the army or in the military, or your interest in the military, heavily influenced your philosophical reading or your approach to it, or who you were reading or what you were looking for?
I think at first it did.
Yeah.
But I think for me now, that was so long ago, almost like a whole different life.
Yeah.
That it doesn't do much of that for me now. It's kind of weird when, there's a lot of vets who've seen combat now. I didn't see combat because I got out in the budget cuts before Desert Shield started. We're realizing the peace dividend, as they called it. Yeah. So I even don't. It's so long ago. I don't even most of the time think of myself as a vet.
Yeah.
But it certainly made a huge impact on me, like running through my undergraduate time and even part of the graduate school. I was tied up with that. I kept wearing my field jacket, the stuff that in my boots. I still walk at 120 steps per minute as sort of a matter of course. But I think that's something I kind of liked about it.
Yeah.
There were some thinkers and some passages that I suppose I probably related to a lot more than my fellow students did. Particularly those who are sort of anti-military or those who just didn't have any sort of connection with it. So when Plato's talking about the auxiliaries, the lesser guardians in the Republic, you have this whole class of people who are not the rulers. They're not the think tank people. They're the soldiers, the policemen, the the people who risk for their livelihood, you can say. Well, I really identified with that. And yeah, I'd say it probably had some role in attracting me to Nietzsche. I went through a big Nietzschean phase.
Yeah.
I've never been very comfortable with anti-military stuff for its own sake.
Yeah.
Even today. I also think too that you need military people to keep military stuff from getting corrupted. So you see, for example, a lot of police departments heavily militarized now, and they probably shouldn't be. And a lot of the criticism of that comes from people who've been in the military who are like, you need to leave the soldiering to the actual soldiers.
Yeah, totally.
Don't give some person who got a criminal justice degree and then went to the police academy for some training. Don't give them the same hardware that you're giving us, because they're not up to handling it. And I don't want to paint with too broad a brush. I think there's some police departments where perhaps they really do need it because they're facing down heavily armed gangs. In which case there should be like a small portion that have that. And I think that there's some that are well trained and don't get involved in using really excessive force. But when you read these stories about raids where they're going in with military equipment and essentially terrorizing the civilian population, that's where I think a lot of military people and ex-military people are like, that's not what you're supposed to be doing. That's what we do, but we do it to other people who are shooting at us.
Right. Yeah.
So, yeah. So I think there should be more room for that perspective.
Totally.
In these discussions, rather than just down with the fascists.
No, absolutely.
Everybody's a fascist if you want them to be.
Of course. Yeah. Yeah.
Paint them all.
Now that's it. The word's getting tossed around quite a bit. I mean, I think reading these texts that you've mentioned will cause people to re-examine themselves, and maybe think twice before hurling some political accusations.
Yeah, I think part of what's going on with these virtue ethics texts is it says, okay, society can be really messed up, and we probably do need to be politically active and try to change things. But you're not going to, if that's where your primary focus is, you're either going to be ticked off all the time or depressed or crazy idealistic, because you're not going to change the whole system, but you do have the opportunity to change this messed up part of it that is your personality and your relationships. And it places the stress on focusing there and making some progress there,
Man, that's fantastic. Greg, it has been a pleasure.
Yeah.
Man.
Glad to come on.
I'm happy to have you. Podcast number 1, the very first ever. One day in the future we're gonna have to talk about some Nietzsche and
that'd be fun.
Oh yeah. I'm sure we'll have plenty of stuff to talk about. But where can people find you, really quick?
Oh, okay. So there's the YouTube channel, of course, and I'll just send you the links to that so you can put it in there.
Absolutely.
My business is Reason.io, like reason it out with the IO capitalized, so they can go to reasonio.com if they're interested in philosophical counseling or tutoring or booking me for talks.
Great.
I mentioned that I'm the editor for Stoicism Today, so I should put in a plug for that, since one of my jobs is doing PR for them too. Right.
Excellent.
So it's a cool thing. Every week we have a piece by somebody about how to apply Stoicism to everyday life. And the other place, if people are interested in online classes, we have a Teachable Academy through Reason.io. And we don't have a lot of classes in there yet, but I'm developing a number of online classes that learners can use. For example, Nicomachean ethics. We've got some classes coming out this month that people can work at their own pace, and there's videos and handouts and lesson pages and quizzes, and And so we talked about that. How do you read these texts, right? That can be a useful support, I think, for some people.
Yeah, fantastic. You can also find Greg on Patreon and support him and his show at patreon.com/Dr. G.B. Sadler. And I have one last question for you, Greg, and that's just,
Okay.
it's very simple. It's just, what's your favorite bookstore, man?
Oh, that's a tough one. Because we're actually, when we moved here to Milwaukee, we brought 95 bankers boxes worth of books.
Nice.
And
You are a bookstore.
So we got rid of much of that.
Yeah.
Taking it to half price books and getting paid very little for it. But probably helping the greater Milwaukee area with a lot of the stuff. So I haven't been in a book buying mood for quite a while.
Totally.
I do like half price books, but I don't go there to cut down on the temptation to buy books.
With that, no, I totally. It's an addiction we struggle with, step by step, every day. So half price books in Milwaukee. It's a good stop.
Yeah, it would be in the Milwaukee area. There's several of them. One is in Brookfield, and I forget where the other two are. But yeah, there's quite a few of them throughout the Midwest. And I think in the South as well.
Oh, excellent.
They're kind of a chain. And they tend to have a really good selection. Things. One of the things I like, they're organized.
Yeah.
You go into a lot of used bookstores and you gotta look.
Yeah, definitely. So half price books. Check it out if you're in the area. Okay, Greg, thank you so much. We'll talk again very soon. Really appreciate it. All the best to you, and have a wonderful day, man.
Thanks. Sounds great. You too.
Take care. Ciao. Hope you guys enjoyed. Thanks to Greg Sadler, awesome guy and a true thinker. You can find him on youtube.com/GBI Sadler, and you can donate to his Patreon at patreon.com/Dr. G.B. Sadler. And you can help support this podcast and show by going to patreon.com/booksarebetterthanfood. Thanks so much for listening, guys. Always remember, life is too short to read bullshit. Take care and have a great night. Ciao.